Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you're zooming from. This is Antonio Andreoni from IIPP. I will be chairing this seminar today with Professor Eric Helleiner and also with our Olga Mikheeva, who is going to provide comments for discussion. We will wait a few minutes to get people into the room, and then we will start. We have quite a few people registered, so I hope people will be able to join us for tonight. And also as a reminder to everyone joining, we will be recording this event, and this will be online in the UCL IIPP YouTube channel. Okay, I think we will just potentially start with my usual few remarks, and then while people still join the room, and I will give also a brief introduction to our speaker tonight. My first remark is that we are particularly pleased to have this discussion tonight around a book which is extremely relevant for the work that we do at IIPP and more broadly for the discussion around the role of the state and what the state represents historically, the structural information of capitalism, and of course, different variety of capitalism across the world. And Eric's work is very much challenging a number of assumptions and ideas and interpretation of these concepts and theories of neomercantilism. So we are particularly pleased to have the chance to discuss tonight this new book with this author. Eric is professor at University Research Chair at the University of Waterloo, and is based at the Department of Political Science in the School of International Affairs. And he has been a very prolific scholar over the last years, working on issues related really to the global political economy, institutions, history of ideas. And among his books, I would like to also remember the Forgotten Foundation of Bretton Woods with Cornell in 2014, the Status Quo Crisis with Oxford in 2014, and also Governing the World's Biggest Markets, again with Oxford University Press in 2019. So this book really comes after, I understand, several years of production and development of ideas. So it's a privilege to have Professor Helleiner with us for this discussion. As usual, we will follow standard format. Eric will be talking for 40-45 minutes, and then we will have a response from Olga, who is one of our Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow here at the Institute, who has been also working a lot on developmental finance and developmental state in East Asia over the East Asian Middle. Without further ado, I think there are a number of people here already. I would invite Eric to take the lead, and finally, just to say, those of you who want to start asking questions, you can use the chat function, and we will open the floor after Olga's initial discussant remarks to the floor to engage with our speaker. Eric, thanks so much, and you're welcome, and anytime you're ready, we can start. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Antonio. And so let me just share my screen if I can. Is everybody able to see that okay?
Fantastic, perfect.
Yes, great. So yes, thanks so much for this invitation, Antonio. I'm grateful to everyone who's interested in this intellectual history that, as Antonio alluded to, I've been working on for many years, probably too many years, 5 or 6 at least. And I'd particularly like to thank Olga as well for her willingness to comment on this work. I'm sorry I can't be there to meet everybody in person, but I'm appreciative that the technology allows us to connect in this way. So Antonio suggested I take about 45 minutes, so I'll do that to provide a bit of an overview of the book and just feature some of the things that I hope people might find interesting. I'm going to do the following things here. I'm going to begin with just exploring why you should be interested in the history of neomercantilist thought. I think it's a very important topic at this particular moment in the history of the global political economy. And as I'll mention there, it's extremely understudied for reasons which I'll speculate about briefly there. And then I want to just clarify very quickly what I mean by neomercantilism. This is a term that has a checkered history. And then I really want to get into the meat of the presentation, which is to outline, first of all, the common view of its history. When this history is discussed, how is it discussed? And then highlight what I think are some really profound limitations of that common view. And I want to emphasize that I myself have been a proponent of the common view in the past. And so this is very much a mea culpa book trying to explain some things that I feel I got wrong and that other people I think in the field of political economy have also been misinterpreting. And then I want to try to highlight, just to go into a bit more detail in one case, which is the case of China, and highlight how when you reinterpret the history of neomercantilist thought in a different way than the common view, we actually have some really important insights, not just historical, but also for interpreting Chinese thinking about political economy in the current period. And then I'll sum up with some 5 kind of broad points. So let me just address the first question of why you should be interested in the history of neomercantilist thought. So if you pick up any textbook in international political economy, but this is also true of books in comparative political economy or even textbooks in development studies, they often will portray that there are 3 kind of ideologies. So I put up here on the screen Robert Gilpin's famous book from 1987 that was used by many, many people as a textbook for years. And he had this chapter to 3 ideologies of political economy, by which he meant Marxism, economic liberalism, and what I'm calling neo-mercantilism. But at that time, he actually called economic nationalism. And there, I just want to emphasize, and I don't have time to go into this in any detail. You have to look at the book to find the detailed discussion of this issue. But the phrase neo-mercantilism sometimes goes under the label of economic nationalism, as Gilpin used it, sometimes under statism, sometimes under developmentalist thought, sometimes developmental statist thought, sometimes statist developmentalism. So there are all kinds of different labels. But I think they're all pushing at a fairly similar idea, which I'll explain in a second. I actually think neomercantilism is the best phrase to be using. Now, why should we be interested in the history of this? I think because this ideology is increasingly prominent in policymaking circles today. There's growing criticism of free trade from a neomercantilist standpoint coming into growing political prominence in countries across the world. And I've just put here on the slide, of course, Donald Trump was very much a neomercantilist in the way he thought about foreign economic relations, but so too is the leader in the other major economic power in the world, Xi Jinping in China, very much has a neomercantilist approach to foreign economic policy. And many other countries, we see a growing interest in neomercantilist ideas, criticisms of free trade coming from a neomercantilist standpoint. This is true of Canada, where I work, but it's also true of many other countries. Now, what's striking is that there's a very poor understanding of the pre-1945 history of this ideology. You know, if you think about the comparison to the 2 other ideologies, if you go into any library, you'll find many, many books on the shelf describing the pre-1945 history of economic liberalism, usually beginning with Adam Smith and carrying through the classical liberals in the 19th century on through Hobson and Keynes, etc. The same is true of Marxist approaches to political economy, enormous number of books you can find. But if you try to find a book about the history of neomercantilist thought, there's very little. And I think this is a really a strange phenomenon. I actually didn't write this book starting off with the intention of writing this book. I was writing a broader history of pre-1945 ideas about foreign economic policy, about international political economy more generally, and was very struck the more I got into it that there was just this huge hole in the literature in trying to understand the history of neo-mercantilist thought. I'll explain in a second what some of the common views are, but also why I think they are incomplete. And I don't know why this is. I think it's an interesting thing, kind of in terms of sociology of knowledge. I speculate at the beginning of the book some possible reasons. So for example, one possible reason is that the binary of the Cold War, the kind of ideological binary of the Cold War, encouraged people to think about political economy in binary terms between, capitalism, liberalism, and Marxism and the communist bloc. And then I think when, the Cold War ends, it's kind of the triumph of neoliberal thought at that time. And so the idea that someone would go back and, try to understand protectionist ideas just seemed kind of outdated, just as Marxism increasingly looked outdated to many people in that kind of triumph of neoliberalism period. So I don't, those are some possible reasons, but in any case, whatever the reason is, we are really severely lacking a serious history of this ideology. And so I'm trying to fill that gap in the literature, because I think people need to understand the roots of these ideas. And as I'll come back to at the very end of today's presentation, even to understand Donald Trump and the tradition that he's carrying on in American politics, but also the tradition of Xi Jinping. These are traditions that are not well understood in existing political economy textbook. And so I've set out to try to correct that. And as I said, I very quickly realized that my own understanding and conventional understandings were, I think, quite misleading and incomplete. So now let me just quickly address this question of what is neomercantilism. So here's the definition that I use in the book, which is a belief in the need for strategic trade protectionism and other forms of government economic activism to promote state wealth and power in the post-Smithian age. And so this is a very, if you take off the last 4 words, this is a very similar definition as you might find for mercantilism itself, a belief in the need for state strategic trade protectionism and other forms of government economic activism to promote state power and wealth. And that's very deliberate. What I'm trying to say is that neomercantilists were people who updated their mercantilist views that, here I have a picture on the slide of Colbert, famous French mercantilist. European mercantilism was a very active ideology. Smith comes with The Wealth of Nations and critiques it. But then there are many people who say, I understand the flaws that Smith pointed out in mercantilist thought, but I still believe in the need for strategic trade protections and other forms of government economic activism to promote state power and wealth. And so those, in my view, are neo-mercantilists. They're people who are familiar with Smith's critique and the influence that classical economic liberalism begins to have in the 19th century, but they continue to defend what had been the mercantilist policy preferences, as well as the focus on state power and wealth. And so just to emphasize a couple of small differences that we see between neo-mercantilists and mercantilists, Smith kind of demolished the mercantilist view that wealth and specie should be equated. And so there's very, very few of the neo-mercantilists propound that kind of view. There's not the same focus on the idea that wealth comes from accumulating specie. Similarly, a big difference is the much heavier push in the neo-mercantilist literature in the 19th and early 20th century on the need for industrialization. So that is present in earlier mercantilist thought, but is much stronger in the 19th and early 20th century. Industrialization, as I'll come to in a second, comes to be seen as central for cultivating state wealth and power in what has become, the industrial age. Now, just to mention a couple of quick things here, you might think, well, why not just call these people protectionists? Well, there's a very clear reason for that. Not all protectionists are neo-mercantilists. So take, for example, someone who believes in autarky. They are not neo-mercantilists. Neo-mercantilists are people who believe in an open world economy. Your country should be trading an open world economy, but you're trading on the basis of a highly state-led strategy. And that strategic word that I have in the definition is core there, that the protectionism is designed to cultivate local sectors, especially industrial sectors, behind tariff walls in a very strategic way. It's not meant to insulate the economy from the whole outside world in an autarkic manner. So now let me just say quickly something about comparing this to Marxism and economic liberalism, the other key ideologies that people like Gilpin or other textbooks identify. So obviously this is a very different ideology than Smithian liberalism. You know, it's very critical of the free trade orientation of Smith and subsequent classical liberal economists. And it's also much less focused on the kind of liberal aspirations for individual liberty, for kind of international peace, and for cosmopolitan goals of global prosperity. The priority is state power and wealth. You know, it's the power and wealth of your own state. Similarly, if you think about a comparison to Marxism, you know, this is not an ideology which is necessarily challenging capitalism, and issues of class are not at the center of this ideology. I'll come back in a second to highlight how some neomercantilists are interested in distributional issues, but not with the same focus of the Marxist focus on class exploitation and challenging capitalism. The focus is on promoting state power and wealth, and this can be fully compatible with capitalism. Okay, that's some definitional issues. I hope that clears up some discussion about what I mean by neomercantilism. Now, what's the common view of its history? The common view focuses on Friedrich List, who writes this famous book in 1841, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, called The National System of Political Economy. And why do people focus on him? And by the way, I should emphasize here the extent to which people in textbooks feature List as if he is the same kind of figure as Adam Smith is for classical liberalism, classical economic liberalism, or that Marx is for Marxism. So it's, and I'm going to come back to critique this view in a second. Why is List given this kind of central position? It's because he did develop one of the most sophisticated critiques of the Smith, what he called the Smithian school. And it's also because his ideas had a lot of influence around the world. And so I detail in the book the extent to which List was read around the world and attracted followers in all continents. In the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century, the book is translated into English, French, Spanish, Hungarian, Romanian, into Russian, to Bulgarian, into Chinese, Bengali, Japanese. You know, it really has a cosmopolitan life, if you like. And the attraction, I think, of his ideas is that he provided this defense of strategic protectionist policies and a critique of free trade in a way that emphasized that free trade was an ideology of British domination. And that was very appealing to people around the world who were finding themselves experiencing British power. And what List said, you know, at the core of his critique is that a country like the German states at the time he's writing, or France, or the United States, where he lives for some time, he also lives in France for some time, that all of these states who are subject to British economic power in the 19th century needed not to embrace the free trade ideology coming out of Britain, but rather to be rejecting it and applying strategic protectionist policies. So what is his reasonings? I think some of you will know these arguments very well, so let me just go through them very quickly. But the first argument is that you have to industrialize. And so for him, industrialization is the key for state wealth and power. It's partly, you know, he has a lot of arguments about why industrialization brings wealth. His arguments about productivity gains and more diverse employment opportunities, but he also has some kind of broader arguments about the civilizational advancement, he calls it, that comes from having industrialization. So growing political liberty, a growing kind of socio-cultural progress. And these things build what he calls the productive powers of a country. That's a phrase that many Listians like to use. At the same time, he emphasizes the importance of industrialization for state power. And so here it's partly military power. If you don't have industry, you're not going to be able to defend yourself against the British, but even you're not going to be able to project power abroad. And it's often forgotten that List was someone who was a strong supporter of European imperialism. And he thought one of the reasons you want to industrialize this is that you too can become an imperial power. He's an advocate of colonial expansion by European states at that time. He's also arguing more generally that you want to accumulate industry in order to reduce your dependence on foreigners. So he says, imports of manufacturing, especially key manufacturers for the cultivation of wealth and power, they're unreliable. You can't rely on imports, and sometimes your exporting isn't reliable. The markets get closed off suddenly. So you need to be focused on this. And at the core of that issue is his critique of liberals for being what he perceives as naive, that they don't understand the conflictual nature of international relations and that states have to look after their own interests. So I'll just give you one of the most famous quotes from his book, where he says, the Smithian school takes no account of nations, but simply of the entire human race on the one hand, that's the cosmopolitanism, and of single individuals on the other. And so he's saying, you've got to, that's the problem with liberalism. They're not focused on the conflictual nature of the international relations and the need for states to look after their own interests. So the other part of his key argument is that you have to industrialize with state activism, especially tariffs. And so why are tariffs needed? It's a kind of an infant industry case where he's saying, first comers like the British, who industrialized first, they have all kinds of advantages which other states can't compete effectively with. And they also, he argues, engage in dumping practices. And so he says, competing with England is like, here's the quote, a child or a boy who's wrestling with a strong man. It's an unfair competition. So you need to have tariffs to allow local industries to build up in order for them to finally be able to compete with the British. And I should emphasize here too, because it's a point I think is not often understood about List, is he also wanted the tariff to attract foreign investment to set up plants behind a tariff wall. And that was another way to cultivate industry. It wasn't just that you were supporting domestically owned firms, but also trying to attract foreign investment behind the tariff wall. So he's very welcoming of foreign investment. That's a contrast to some other neoliberals. And the other point that he makes about this is what Britain itself had done. And so he kind of highlights the hypocrisy in his view of the British free trade ideology. And so this is the quote that many of you will know, where he says, it's a very common device that when anyone has attained the summit of greatness, meaning the British, he kicks away the ladder by which he has climbed up in order to deprive others of the means of climbing up after him. And so he sort of thinks that England is trying to monopolize the manufacturing power of the whole world by pushing free trade, even though it itself, in competing with the Dutch, that's the picture I have on the slide here, when the British were competing with the Dutch, they were using the same kind of mercantilist policies that he is now advocating as a neo-mercantilist. Now, one final thing I just want to emphasize about List is that he acknowledged that tariffs generated economic costs. And so he is accepting the Smithian argument, that free trade does create economic efficiencies, no question about that. But what he's arguing is that the long-term gains of doing strategic protectionism are going to outweigh those short-term costs. And so it's cultivating this deeper productive powers of a state in a way over time. And this is very much a temporal story. And I feel like sometimes people miss the fact that List sees nationalism as playing a central role in cultivating that temporal worldview. So I'll just give you a quote here where he says, we must have enough national spirit at once to plant and protect the tree, which will yield its first richest fruits only to future generations. In other words, there's a sense, that you're going to take some economic costs for doing this in the short term, but the nation as a whole is going to gain some advantages over the long term. And so that's, it's a very neo-mercantilist thing. It's understanding Smith's critique, but saying, I still believe in protectionism because of this longer term benefit. Okay, what are the limitations of the focus on List? So the story about List being important to the 19th century is not inaccurate. List did attract a global audience, as I mentioned earlier, but it's a very incomplete story. And I just want to highlight two ways in which it's incomplete. One is that there were important adaptations of List's ideas I think we need to recognize as important contributions to neomercantilist thought, because they have left legacies in many countries. And so if you only introduce students to List, you don't understand that many of the people who followed List modified his ideas in often very profound ways, which changed the content of neomercantilist thought in important ways that had legacies into the current period. That's the first. And the second is that there were many neomercantilists, including incredibly important people, influential people, including those who've left legacies in the current period, who are cited today in China and the United States as two examples, who really had very little interest in List. And this, this is something that I found surprising, because I began to, research the history of this ideology, and I felt like I would find the same stories you would find with Marxism or with liberalism, where everybody's tracing it back to the single figure in the way that the textbooks suggest, but it's simply not the case. There were many, many neo-mercantilist thinkers, very significant thinkers, who either were unaware of List's ideas or pretty uninterested in List's ideas. And so it's a different kind of ideology in terms of its history than economic liberalism and Marxism, which you really can trace to these central individuals. This is an ideology that emerged in a more decentralized manner in different parts of the world. So that's the second point that I want to emphasize. So let me just mention a couple of the adaptations of List's ideas that I think were particularly interesting. And there's lots of examples I have in the book. I can't obviously go through them. But I just want to feature two in particular I think are really interesting ones. One took place in South Asia in the British colony of India, where there's a figure, Mahadev Govind Ranade, who's a very central figure in the Indian nationalist movement. He's a founding member of the Indian National Congress. His ideas influenced later Indian nationalists, including Nehru. And Ranade is very attracted to the Listian message. And so he's very much a follower of List about the importance of protectionism. But he challenges a number of List ideas. Let me just mention two in particular that he challenges in interesting ways. List had these very odd ideas about where neo-mercantilist policy should be pursued. In particular, he thought they should only be pursued in temperate regions of the world. It was a kind of a climactic theory, whereas tropical regions of the world, he argued, were unfitted by nature, is the phrase he used, to manufacturing. And in his view, they should be destined to be commodity exporters using free trade policies. In other words, his advice, which came to be followed in many parts of the world that were in what he would call tropical regions. He didn't want them to follow this advice. He thought his advice was only relevant for, and he was really focused on German states, France, and the United States. Those are his most important cases. And Ranade looks at that and he says, I just don't understand that argument, and critiques the deeper kind of Eurocentrism, which underlay List's views about that. I just want to emphasize the Eurocentrism of List's thought. On the right-hand side here of the slide, I've put the first. List has several books that make up the 1841 text, and the first book is called The History. And look at the history that List thought was relevant for anyone to understand to study political economy. It's all European and one chapter on North Americans. There's just no sense that the history of any other part of the world is relevant to understanding political economy. And just to emphasize this in one more way, because I'm going to come back to this at the end, listen to List's view of Asia. He says, Europe will sooner or later find herself under the necessity of taking the whole of Asia under her care and tutelage, as already India has been so taken in charge by England. In this utter chaos of countries and peoples, there exists no single nationality which is either worthy or capable of maintenance and regeneration. Hence, the entire dissolution of the Asiatic nationalities appears to be inevitable, and a regeneration of Asia only possible by means of the infusion of ideas of European vital power, of the general introduction of the Christian religion, and of European moral laws and order, and by European immigration and the introduction of European systems of government. I mean, that is just an extraordinary statement of Eurocentrism that underlay List's views about the rest of the world. And Ranade has really challenged that and saying, India can industrialize. In fact, he points out that Indian manufacturing had been more advanced than British manufacturing had been before the British were coming into India, and he attacks those who assign what he says, assign much of the world to be commodity exporters. And he also attacks List's support for the economic List that colonialism would bring economic benefits. And Ranade says, look what's happened to India. And he has a very sophisticated critique of the economic impact of British colonialism on the Indian context. He he says that India has been turned into a dependency. And this, this is writing in the late 19th century, well before the rise of Latin American dependency theory. So that's one thing. The other thing about Ranade that's interesting is that he has much more ambitious ideas of what the state can do than what List is. List is really focused on tariffs. He has a few passages in the text, a few parts of the book where he discusses other things the state might do domestically, but he isn't very interested in them. He's really focused on the need to protect the border. That's the key form of state activism. And Ranade says, look, I can ask the British to give up free trade, like not impose free trade in India, but I don't think I'm going to be very successful. So I have to have other ways of trying to appeal to them to promote industry in India. And he comes up with some very interesting ideas about the government playing a very activist role domestically within the country to promote industrialization by subsidizing firms, creating state-owned enterprises, spending on infrastructure, education, and doing all of this by borrowing the colonial state, borrowing capital and relending it at low interest rates domestically. So these are, much more ambitious ideas than List himself had. And that's true of many of List's followers, that they have much more ambitious ideas about the state could do, especially in late comers to industrialization. Now, let me just mention one other key person who adapts List's ideas in interesting ways, and that's the Romanian thinker, Mihail Manulescu, who has a very distinctive version of neomercantilism. And, this is a figure who writes a book in 1929, The Theory of Protectionism and International Trade. It's really the best known neomercantilist text in the interwar period. And is read in many parts of the world, including in Latin America and across Eastern Europe. And it's a defense of protectionism from a neo-mercantilist standpoint. He goes beyond List in quite a few ways, actually, but let me just mention two of the more interesting ones. One is he has much more ambitious ideas about protectionism than List. So it's sometimes forgotten that List wanted tariffs, but in only a limited way and in a temporary way, and only on certain industrial products as well as shipping in some cases. And Manulescu says, no, you need this much more ambitious forms of protectionism, and it can cover all sectors. His underlying this was a view that economic development needed to shift workers from low productivity sectors to higher productivity sectors. And so he said any protectionist policy was justified if it encouraged the growth of those sectors where productivity surpassed the average productivity of the country, even if those sectors weren't internationally competitive. And so it's a much more ambitious sense of what protectionism could do. And he also had the idea that any country can do this. So like Ranade, he's challenging List's odd ideas about that. But the other thing I found very interesting about this Romanian thinker is the extent to which he puts neo-mercantilist thought in a multilateral context. So here I have a picture of the League of Nations Assembly, and Manulescu was involved in debates with the Latin America, with the League of Nations. He was involved in debates at the League of Nations, and he says, really what neo-mercantilism needs is a recognition from multilateral institutions of the legitimate right for countries to use protectionist policies. Because at the time, the League is promoting our free trade ideas, and he thinks that's really incorrect. And so it's quite an interesting early statement of how international trade institutions could be supporting. Like, this is not just something the state does on its own; it needs the support of some multilateral institution. And by the way, List did have one small passage about this in an unpublished work in 1837, where he actually proposed a World Trade Congress. I haven't had time to look whether this is the first ever proposal of this kind, but certainly one of the earliest proposals for a kind of a multilateral trading institution. And it's interesting that, both, and List doesn't say a lot about it, and this is where Manulescu really develops this in a much more detailed way. But it's interesting that it's neomercantilists rather than liberals who are often promoting these ideas of multilateral trading institutions very early on in the process. And I think you can, in some ways it makes sense, because they're calling for managed trade, and then they begin to think, oh, how do you think about managed trade in a multilateral context? And you might need some institutions to help with that management. Okay, so those are just two examples of interesting adaptations that had a lot of influence in local contexts. In the case of Romanian thinker, and much wider, even beyond his own country. Now, there are many other adaptations of List's ideas. I just put 4 different examples here of ones I go into in the book. One is in the Japanese context. This is Matsukata, who's a finance minister in the 1880s and into the 1890s, continues to play a major role in the Japanese government. And he really he's interested in List's ideas, but he develops the financial side of a neomercantilist project in much more detail, especially constructing a central bank and what state lending institutions could do. List doesn't say much about that stuff, so it's kind of the financial dimensions. This is a picture of Alejandro Bunge, who's an Argentine fan of List, and Bunge develops List's ideas in different directions, especially focusing on the terms of trade, which was not a major part of List's work, and Bunge kind of anticipates Prebisch's more famous ideas about declining terms of trade for commodity exporters. This is a picture of Turkish thinker Ziya Gökalp, who I've put here because he's a big fan of List in the 1920s and very influential in Turkey in economic circles. And he's really arguing that the state needs to take a much more ambitious role than List himself advocated. He says, I like List's ideas, but he advocates state capitalism, in much more ambitious forms of government intervention. And then the final one is a picture of Binoy Kumar Sarkar, who's Indian, a figure in the interwar period, one of the most famous Indian social scientists in the interwar period, who also translates List and has also quite ambitious ideas about economic planning. And interestingly, like Manulescu, has some ideas about multilateral cooperation, how that might coincide with neomercantilist views. And the other reason that Sarkar is interesting is that he says these neomercantilist ideas had roots not just in European thought, in kind of European mercantilist thought, but also in South Asian mercantilist thought. And he begins to talk a lot about the Arthashastra, which is a ancient text from South Asia, which can be conceptualized as a mercantilist text because it was about how rulers should cultivate state power and wealth. And Sarkar says, I'm carrying on a tradition which doesn't just come out of Europe, but also has deeper roots in South Asian intellectual history. And what all of these thinkers also did was rejected List's ideas about where in the world can neomercantilism happen. In their view, List's ideas about just focusing on temperate regions of the world is too narrow. List's focus on Europe and North America. Okay. Now, let me just quickly go to the second limitation of the kind of List-centric views of the history of this ideology. And I've already mentioned the extent to which people see List in the same way as Smith and Marx. And here's where I want to emphasize that this is wrong, that there's so many thinkers who don't refer to List or aren't, they may know of List, but they're not that interested in List's views. And so I highlight a number of those, and I just want to give you a couple of quick examples here. One of the most important by far is Henry Carey, who's an American figure in the mid 19th century, writes this famous book in the late 1850s, Principles of Social Science. And Carey is a major influence on the American Republican Party, which is being formed in the 1850s and adopts a protectionist platform. Here's the document from 1860, which is a National Republican Platform. And in Carey's protectionist ideas, form the foundation of American protectionism for the rest of the century. In fact, you can still find references to Carey's work well into the 1920s in Republican circles. So he's really a central figure. And so when Trump is invoking the Republican protectionist past, he's really invoking the Carey tradition from the pre-1945 period. And what's interesting about Carey is he wasn't very interested in List. He certainly knew of List's ideas, but he wasn't very interested in them, and I demonstrate that in the book. And what's I found very interesting about Carey is that he was not just influential in the United States, but he had a global audience. So just as List, his ideas are circulating around the world, Carey's were too. So there were fans of Carey in Japan, in Latin America, in Africa. I have a section on an Ethiopian thinker who's very influenced by Carey. And many, Carey is really like List in terms of having a global influence. And his ideas were different. So I don't have time to go into all of the differences, but if I can just emphasize one in particular, it's that Carey had a much more social view of what protectionism would do. It wasn't just cultivating the power and wealth of a state. It was also forming a redistributive role of attacking traders who he saw as a kind of elite figure who's exploiting farmers and workers and helping the farmers and workers to gain more power within the country. I don't have time to explain why that is, but it's very interesting. And his social thought even went into discussing gender issues. And so he argues that essentially women are being harmed by free trade, and it was only by protectionism that you could create gender equality within countries. And so he saw gender equality and neomercantilism as a project that in fact went hand in hand. One reinforced the other. And then he even had arguments about the environmental effects of free trade. Those of you who know about Justus von Liebig's ideas of chemistry and how they began to be applied to political economy by figures like Marx in the mid-1860s. Well, Carey had done that actually even earlier than Marx, and brought into his critique of free trade Liebig's ideas about soil erosion and how free trade would degrade soils. And so, you know, it's a much wider idea of why you do protectionism than List. So state power and wealth is there, but also these social and even environmental arguments. Where do his ideas come from? A lot of them are developed on his own, but he's very much influenced by Alexander Hamilton, who was a figure that also influenced List, but it creates this kind of different lineage, a non-Listian lineage, if you like, through American protectionist thought. Let me just mention a couple of other figures elsewhere in the world who are not influenced by List. One is in Latin America. This is a picture of Lucas Alemán, who's a Mexican figure in the 1830s who promotes very innovative views about the need for Mexico to embrace protectionist policies, as well as a state bank that can support the development of textile manufacturing. And so he becomes a critic of liberal thought, thinks you need this kind of state action to promote Mexican industrialization. And his ideas are influenced by some European mercantilist thought, especially Spanish mercantilist thought that was influential in Mexico in the colonial period, late Bourbon mercantilism, but also by a kind of domestic group of textile manufacturers in the Puebla region. You know, it's one of the major textile regions in the colonial period, and they're developing how do they defend their interests against British textiles. This is a picture of Muhammad Ali from Egypt, who rules Egypt in the first part of the 19th century. And Ali is such an interesting figure because he is aware of economic liberal thought, but he rejects it, and he rejects it much more profoundly than almost any other figure in the first half of the 19th century. And so he pursues this, as I'm sure many of you are aware, this incredibly ambitious industrialization strategy, building modern factories, massive infrastructure programs. The state takes over the agricultural sector, there's monopolies of trading, and all of this is done with the developmental goal of building the wealth and power of Egypt at that time, and I think he deserves to be, you know, recognized as a significant neo-mercantilist thinker. He didn't leave a treatise, but he left all kinds of texts, interviews and speeches and things that people have drawn on, and I cite in the book to highlight the innovative nature of his thought. Much more ambitious than anything that List was outlining in terms of what the state should do. And by the way, it's really striking that Ali is doing these incredibly ambitious policies at the very moment that List is writing his book, and List makes no mention of Ali. Like, it's part of List's Eurocentrism. He just dismisses, you know, what's going on outside of the European and North American context. And in fact, he doesn't think, you know, Egypt should be trying to do this. He's very clear about that. He doesn't discuss Ali directly, but he says Egypt should not be trying to industrialize. This is a Japanese figure. And I spent a lot of time in the Japanese case in the book because a lot of people, and this included me before I had a chance to look at this in great detail, a lot of people have depicted the Meiji Restoration period, the rapid industrialization, state-led industrialization process in Japan, as a kind of a Listian project. And there were certainly people who are interested in List's ideas in Japan. I've already cited one of them, Matsukata, who I had on a previous slide. But even Matsukata was drawing on a deeply rooted Japanese mercantilist tradition that goes back to the 1700s, 1800s, pre-Meiji. And I explain what the origins of that mercantilist tradition were in daimyo competition within Japan that then, when the Meiji Restoration happens, gets extended to Japan as a whole. In other words, you used to pursue the power and wealth of your small little political entity within the Japanese polity. Now you're pursuing it for Japan as a whole. And this is a figure, Okubo, who's the key figure who writes about the need for Japan to have state-led industrialization in the 1870s. And Okubo was very much influenced by this domestic, this endogenous Japanese neomercantilist tradition. The same is true of Korean neomercantilists in the late 19th century. Much of the literature on Korean developmentalism traces its roots to the Japanese colonial period. But I think it's more accurate, and I think lots of the detailed literature shows this, to see it even further back in a set of developmentalist thinkers, or I call them neomercantilist thinkers, beginning in about the 1870s, of whom this figure, Yu Kil-chun, is the most important, who are developing neomercantilist ideas before the Japanese colonial period about the need for state-led economic development. And they, in turn, are also drawing partly on Japanese ideas that are coming from the Meiji experience, but also on an endogenous tradition that I explain in the book. Okay, now let me just say something quickly. I know I don't have a lot of time, but let me just quickly go through the Chinese case, because I think this is a really important case for people to understand in the current period. So the Chinese neomercantilist ideas emerge after the Opium Wars. This is a picture from the first Opium War. And really there's it's after the Second Opium War especially, where there's the emergence of a self-strengthening movement, which is calling for state-led economic modernization of China at a time when the Western powers are pushing free trade. There's kind of a reaction against that. But what's really striking and important to recognize the extent to which Chinese thinkers are not drawing on List, nor on Carey, nor on these other European or North American neomercantilist thinkers. There's really very little awareness of that Western neomercantilist tradition until the early 20th century. Instead, they're drawing on domestic ideas. Some of them are ancient Chinese thoughts. I have a picture here from the book of Lord Zhang, which goes way back to the period of the Warring States. And they're often invoking Zhang's phrase, which is the need for a rich state and strong army. This is also a phrase that's used in Meiji Japan and also amongst the Korean neomercantilists in the late 19th century. They're all drawing on this ancient text, sometimes called the legalist text. And the legalist tradition was one which was often arguing with the Confucians about the need to promote state power and wealth instead of the more Confucian focus on agriculture. Zhang himself was not actually an advocate of industrialization or even particularly of commerce. He believed in state-led agriculture development, but people use his ideas to promote more focus on commerce and industry. And so that's one thing, as an influence of a kind of a statecraft tradition also coming out of a figure. This is a picture of Wei Yung, who emerges after the first Opium War, writing about the need to learn from Western economic techniques to modernize China. And he's part of a deeper statecraft tradition that highlighted the need for state power and wealth. And I don't have time to go into the detail of these ideas, but it's just to highlight their endogenous nature. And so then the key figure who emerges out of that period by the 1870s, 1880s is Zhang Guanying, who is highlighting the need for China to do a rapid state-led industrialization policy. And he depicts this as China being engaged in a kind of commercial war on a worldwide scale. And he draws on Zhang's ideas. He cites back to the Warring States period and said, the Warring States period, China was fighting amongst itself. Now there's a worldwide kind of equivalent, and China must be prepared in a way that leads it to have state-led economic development. But at the core is the sense of a need for large-scale economic reforms, tariffs, state-led support for Chinese firms, promoting infrastructure, even as an idea of what we would call today special economic zones, which he calls multinational public business zones in border regions where foreign investors could come in and support Chinese economic modernization, but under Chinese jurisdiction. And his ideas have some influence. Li Hongjiang in particular, who's a prominent official in China, tries to create some state-sponsored firms in the 1870s and 80s, and Zhang even works in one of them at one point. But his more interesting influence is on Sun Yat-sen, who in fact probably contributed even to some of Zhang's works. And let me just say something quickly about Sun Yat-sen's ideas, because I think they're really important for people to understand, and yet they seem to almost never appear in textbooks on political economy. Sun Yat-sen is a figure better known for his kind of political role. He's the first provisional president of the Republic after the 1911 revolution, but he writes a lot about political economy. And especially after World War I, he's writing very ambitious ideas about the need for China to have state-led industrialization as a way of reacquiring power and wealth within the global political economy. And its ideas about ambitious infrastructure projects, importing foreign capital, but managing it very carefully through the state in a way that is very, very ambitious. But it's not Listian. Like Sun never cites List. Instead, he's drawing on this deeper Chinese tradition. He's drawing on some Western thought, but not the kind of List or Carey style. It's other figures who aren't neo-mercantilist thinkers. He's drawing on them for different kinds of ideas that I describe in the book. And so, I think it's really important to understand Sun's ideas, not just in the fact that he's not drawing on List, but that they're very different than List. And so they're different in the sense of a much more ambitious role of the state than List ever proposed. Sun is much more left-wing politically than List, that highlights the extent to which neomercantilism can be left-wing, can be right-wing. It's not, its political orientation is quite open, but it also highlights the extent to which there's a focus on Asia industrializing in a way that List did not advocate in that quote that I read you earlier. Okay, why does the Chinese case matter? I'm coming to the end here. I think it's important to understand that what Deng Xiaoping did in China after 1978 was essentially a Sun-like project, Sun Yat-sen's vision. Export-oriented, that was key for Sun, state-led industrialization with the use of foreign capital. And this is sometimes called Listian. Sometimes people describe what Deng Xiaoping did as Listian, but I think it's much better to describe it as Sunian, because Deng was very familiar with Sun's ideas. Sun's ideas are being cited in the early 1980s period. I'm awaiting a study which can show us the concrete links here, but so I show some anecdotal evidence in the book about the extent to which Sun was being cited. I don't mean to suggest that Deng Xiaoping was only influenced by Sun Yat-sen, but I'm trying to suggest he was more influenced by this kind of endogenous Chinese tradition than he was by List, for example. Deng, of course, is also drawing on the experience of other East Asian countries when he's thinking about his policy at that time. So there's lots of influences, but one of them is this endogenous Chinese tradition. And I just want to emphasize here the extent to which Xi Jinping has also cited Sun Yat-sen. So at the 150th anniversary of Sun's birth in 2016, Xi Jinping gave the keynote speech where he said, the Chinese Communist Party has been upholding the vision the Sun was outlining after World War I in terms of how do you restore Chinese power and wealth in the world. You do it in the way that Sun was advocating. Okay. One final thing to say about Sun, which is it's one thing that Xi Jinping did in that speech I thought was very interesting, was that he highlighted how China has responsibilities for the world. And this is a quote that he took directly from Sun Yat-sen's work. And Sun Yat-sen himself had some very interesting ideas about this, where he said, China one day will become more wealthy and more powerful, as I'm hoping they will through the strategy that I'm outlining of massive infrastructure spending, state-led industrialization. And he said, once they do, they must have responsibilities for the world. That was the phrase he used. And what he meant by that was essentially leading an anti-imperialist coalition of what he called the weaker and the smaller powers of the world, weaker and smaller peoples in order to oppose the great powers of the world. And Xi Jinping didn't quote that other part of the speech, but it was interesting that he had the same notion from Sun about how once China becomes powerful, it has certain responsibilities. And it's important, I think, to go back to read Sun to see what Sun meant by that. And Sun was in fact invoking a kind of Confucian notion of ruling by right from the kind of tributary ideology of the pre-Opium War period. And I go into quite a bit of detail about that in the book. And so again, very different than List. His vision is, none of that is in List, obviously. Okay, so just to sum up, the importance of this Chinese history, I think, is to understand that Xi Jinping is drawing, his many influences, but one of them is this deeper neo-mercantilist tradition that is not well taught in current political economy texts. Okay, let me sum up as well, because I've gone on too long. I hope Antonio doesn't mind. So let me just highlight 5 key takeaways. I'm trying to emphasize that We have not done a good job, I think, as political economists at understanding the roots of this third key ideology of political economy alongside Marxism and economic liberalism. There are many other ideologies as well, but those are the ones that texts are often featuring. It has a much richer history than List. I'm not saying List isn't an important figure, he was, but there are many other figures that we should be also emphasizing. And that leads to the second point, which is once you recognize that, you see there are many varieties of neomercantilism. Just as there are debates within Marxism and within economic liberalism, there are many debates within neomercantilism, different styles of neomercantilism. And some of them, are really important to understand because they have legacies, like as I've highlighted in the Chinese case. The third key point I just want to mention is, I think this is really interesting, the cosmopolitanism of neomercantilist thought. It's circulated around the world. And I think we're seeing that again today as neomercantilist ideas become more prominent. They're spreading, they're diffusing across borders. And that happened in the 19th century with List's ideas, Carey's ideas, and even in the East Asian context, within the East Asian region, there was a lot of that. I think it's also interesting that they build on diverse mercantilist paths. So it's not just the European mercantilists like Colbert that were being invoked, but also, as I mentioned, Sarkar is invoking the Arthashastra, the Chinese are invoking, the book of Lord Zhang. There's different paths which are being invoked here. And that leads me to the final point, which is, I've misspelled that, just the broader benefits of a wider history. And that is that, by understanding this deeper history of neomercantilism, we can transcend some of the Eurocentrism of the history of economic thought to understand, these different roots, some of which go way back in traditions of political economy. And that neomercantilism has these many different origins, which are not just in a European thinker like List. And I think that leads to the broader benefit of interpreting the current world by understanding. So when Xi Jinping cites Sun Yat-sen, our students should know, what did Sun Yat-sen say? But at the moment they don't, they're given a kind of a List text instead. So there's lots more I could say, there's lots more in the book, but I hope that provides a bit of an overview. And I thank you for listening to a presentation where I've gone on a little bit longer than I should have. I very much look forward to comments from Olga and from others. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, that was great. And I think it's very welcome to reflect and provoke thoughts around these ideas. And of course, we could say even more if we start bringing in, as many of us work on, for example, African developmentalism, lots of the thinkers like Nyerere or Ghana or in Tanzania, so there were lots of variation as well there in the post-colonial time in terms of developmentalism. So I think this is just opening a potential very vast research agenda around this variety of approaches. And now I would say the structure of the experience of colonialism in different moments in time shape similar type of ideas with variation along the of course, the specific context and political economy understanding of society. So that's a fantastic, thanks so much for this fantastic presentation. Olga, you have 10 minutes and then we open the floor. And I invite, again, people to start putting down questions, comments. So we will, I will welcome everyone who wants to join the discussion and graduate to the panel for asking the question directly to the speaker. Olga.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric, again. I enjoyed reading the book. Congratulations. So I'm gonna say more good things, and then I will put 5 broader questions. And great design cover once again. I already said. I also enjoyed it. It's easy to read. It's well written, and there also, I think I enjoyed particularly the elegant comparisons you make between the thinkers. You repeatedly not just describe what they took from List and what additional ideas they brought, but also how they compare to each other. I think that this comparative element is very important. There is a detailed introduction to the Listian world in a way, the world that he lived in, and it's great that the book also, of course, narrates his professional journey to understand, right? He was a real man traveling in space and time as well, and he talked to other real people. So that's very as well useful, and that relates to perhaps my broader idea that it's particularly rewarding and intellectually rewarding and informative to read the books that put intellectual thinkers into the world. And when theories, we know that they are produced by certain people, and they're also relevant to certain time and space. And I think in terms of teaching material, that's very, very important to include. I think the reference, what I found particularly amazing is the reference to the Romanian Manulescu and his notion of industrial protection as the road to international interdependency, right? And amazingly, socialism of nations. It's of course my subjective opinion, but I found it absolutely fascinating discovery. And overall motivation of the book that we need to be prepared intellectually, because the politics realm across the world sees the reemergence of neomercantilists. I think this overall motivation is very, very, of writing the book is very, very inspiring. So my 5 questions. The first one is perhaps about List. The book places the followers of him and the thinkers that are described into, again, context, right, in which they thought and lived. And what about List, in a way that his book was published in German? Obviously, it was meant, as you say, to Germans and French predominantly. 1841, the customs union was already running for less than 10 years. Was it his main aim? Was there any political context that he was trying to fit this work in domestically in Germany? Because I understood that at the time, 41, he was already back from France to Germany. So a little bit of that particular German context, right? Because still it was published in German, perhaps could have been a little bit helpful. And what about cameralism, which in a way of, for example, Eric Reinert would say that, well, that was the localization of mercantilism in Germany. Would you think it's relevant, or maybe it was just you omitted it for the sake of space, right? The second question, the reference is predominantly made, the dialogue, right, between List and other thinkers and Smith. So the reference is always made to his Wealth of Nations. Was there anything about his other work, which heterodox economists favor more, which is the obviously theory of moral sentiments? Did you find across any dialogue or engagement with that work of Smith? The third question would be, in European context, List and his followers were preoccupied with policy response to the British dominance in trade and industry. What about Latin America? There are obviously examples: Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, right? They were short-lived. Was there any inspiration that they could have drawn from the US experience? Hamilton and all that. And here I have the fourth point of question. It's more like a thought experiment. How does a neo-mercantilist government or state might look like today? For example, a lot of followers of List that you described, they were finance ministers, and I think it was not an accident. In the 19th century, the finance ministry was the center of gravity, right, for all things political economy, trade, industry, everything. And in post-World War II developmental states, they were also very empowered finance ministries, and also for a reason. What about today? Do we live in this financialized neomercantilism, right, where the center of gravity actually in the central banks, very technocratic agencies, and the financial sector has become the source of competitive advantage for its own sake? So as a result, we have this mismatch in a way. The neo-mercantilists we read in the book, what about the real world, the real industry, the real production? So how could we draw some meaningful lessons for today. And related to this, and my fifth question is also kind of more future looking, is modern neo-mercantilist state policies compatible with the climate change, climate agenda broadly? Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. These are all great questions. And if I may, I have plenty of myself, but I'll just raise one to add a sixth question, which is very much following from what Olga just mentioned at the very end, which is not so much related to the climate change aspect, because all the things that we talked about, we're living in a different type of world, but all of them had to face one fundamental problem that all the Listian scholars have raised, which is the fallacy of composition, right? What happens if all the state takes a mercantilist or mercantilist type of approach? How do you balance out? And I also share Olga's point around the thinking around the sort of global planning around interdependencies, which sort of create a bridge between these two perspectives, right? Sort of take into account that. So I'm wondering if you have found in your historical analysis, this history of economic analysis, some of those thinkers who had factored in this fallacy of composition problem, and they made them as part of, if you want, their definition of what a neo-mercantilist agenda would look like. I think you have plenty on your plate, Eric. I'm concerned for you. So I think you can start addressing some of these questions. Let's say 2, 3, you can pick whatever you like. And then we bring in another question from the audience so that we create a bit more space. And some of Olga's point, I think you will touch upon in many different responses, because they are extremely deep at the core of your contribution.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much, Olga. Those are very, very thoughtful comments, and I really appreciate them. And some of them I can answer very quickly, which the one about cameralism, exactly, it was literally a question of space. So I was hacking out thousands of words at the last moment, according to the publisher, saying this book is too long already. And so that was one section that ended, but you're absolutely right, that's a central ideology informing List. And interestingly, informing some of the other thinkers who informed List himself. So I cite a couple of people in that early chapter who are influences on List in well, one German in particular, and he's very much in the cameralist tradition. So you're absolutely right to point to that. And also about the customs union, that's very much a context in which he's writing, and he is a big promoter from very early on of that. So you're right to be pointing to that. The question about engaging with Smith's theory of moral sentiments is a very interesting question. Nobody has asked me that before, so I appreciate that question a great deal. I have not found that. I was racking my brain while you were asking that question, trying to think, have I seen that in any of the texts I saw? And I can't think of an example. And I think it raises a bigger question about the fact that a lot of the thinkers that I'm describing were not really engaging with List in a detailed, or engaging with Smith in a detailed way. Like List was, he clearly read Smith very carefully, although he misrepresents Smith in a number of ways. So it's maybe a careful reading, but it's a misleading reading of Smith. But other, a number of other thinkers. Oh, by the way, I should mention Henry Carey too, who is a very central figure for this whole movement. I think he also is a very detailed reader of Smith, and in fact a great fan of Smith, as many of these figures were. Interestingly, they admired what Smith had done for political economy. They just thought he'd pushed free trade too far. But there are others. And you put your finger on it in a way that some of these figures are not deeply trained in political economy. They might be finance ministers. They're in the real world. Or someone like Sergei Vit, the Russian. He's an engineer. Or Manulescu is an engineer. These are people who haven't they haven't studied the great texts. And so they're often, I think, reacting to a caricature of free trade thought rather than some deep engagement with Smith's theory of moral sentiments. So I think that might be part of the answer to your question around that. But it is an interesting question. I'll have to go back and see if I can find in the people who read Smith more carefully, like I'm thinking of Carey here, whether he did the engagement. I don't think he did, but I have to look again. I really like this question about where in a sense would neomercantilism be. I'm paraphrasing you, Olga, but in the sense a lot of these are finance ministry officials in this earlier period. Where would they be today? And I sensed underlying your question was a feeling like they might not be in the finance ministry or in the central bank. And I think there may be some truth to that, in the sense that those parts of the state, I think, have been, in Robert Cox's phrase, kind of more internationalized in the neoliberal era, and the more nationally focused, developmentalist focused, are often elsewhere. So, you can think of the kind of meaty equivalents in different countries. And so it's a very interesting point where I think we do see this in the intra-bureaucratic battles that we're seeing in many countries right now, where it's certain ministries which are usually not the central bank or the finance ministry, which are promoting these ideas, and often the more orthodox position is coming from the parts of the state that need to respond to financial markets and the globalized nature of those markets. But I thought it was an interesting point also because some of these thinkers, I think, really did some interesting thinking about the role of finance in a neomercantilist project. And so List himself is pretty terrible on this issue. Like, he says very little about finance. But some other thinkers really developed interesting ideas. So some of the ideas about developmental banking, and so that's Alemán in Mexico. It's many of these figures are interested in development banks. But there's also some interesting literature, I thought, about kind of the way central banks can play a developmentalist role. And I've written about that in other contexts, like the way developmentalist nature of central banking was emerging, say, in Latin America in the 1930s. And I was really surprised, actually, to find these deeper origins of the idea of central banking as a developmentalist project. But a lot of these thinkers are very interested in that idea. So they see the Bank of England, and it's not a model for them. Like, they want a different kind of central bank that can do developmentalist activity. And what does that mean? It sometimes means direct lending, but it also means exchange rate, active exchange rate management, mobilization of reserves to protect, the currency in a more state power and wealth kind of framing. So it's interesting. And then the one final thing I just want to say about that, if I'm not going on too long, tell me, Antonio, if you want me to stop.
Another 30 seconds, then we get your say from the audience so that we can involve the audience as well.
Sure. Is about the role that a lot of these thinkers gave to the role of foreign capital. And so, like List, and this is also true of Hamilton, for example, and it's also true of Carey, just said, hey, foreign investment should come in, that'd be great. We put up a tariff, it'll jump over the tariff wall, and that's enough. But many of the other thinkers, so that's kind of a foreign direct investment story, but many of the other thinkers are interested in the need for foreign capital to promote latecomer industrialization, but managing it very carefully. And so that's Sun Yat-sen's vision. And Sun, I didn't have time to talk about this, but Sun, probably develops what I think is at least one of the first, if not the first, proposals for a World Bank in his 1920 book, The International Development of China, where he proposes an international development organization, which is it's like the different structure, but the same concept of publicly managed development lending. And that's, not financialized global capitalism, right? It's like state managed foreign capital. And that really, like, the later you get in the latecomer industrialization process historically, the more people are fixated on that. Like, the need to manage, the need for foreign capital in the first place, because there's no way you're going to mobilize enough savings domestically to do the ambitious program, but the need not to be subject to private financial logics. And so I think your question is right on that issue, that finance is key today, but certainly historically to the neomercantilist project. And we were talking just before this session began about Liz Thurbund's book on Korea. She's done a great job of showing, the enduring nature of this focus on finance in what she calls a developmentalist state, or you can think of as neomercantilist. I've got other things to say, but let's.
Yeah, there are a few more questions that we raised. Let's pause 1 second. Let's allow Yatsen to come in and ask his question, and then if there's anyone else, I'll also pick up more questions. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you, Eric, for the very interesting presentation. I wanted to poke your brain a little bit about something. So it seems to me that a lot of what you're discussing is based on this sort of like identification of these three, say strands of economic thought or political economy thought, right? Classical liberalism or neoliberalism in its current form is neomercantilism and Marx, and what you call Marxism. But in my head, a lot of one thing that I thought it was interesting is, at least in terms of the understanding of how sort of like the global economic structure, right, of the global political economy structure of the similarities between the Marxist and this neomercantilist approach seem to be quite salient. So, for example, I'm thinking about, you for example, said at the beginning of the presentation that you would think of people that are developmentalists as neomercantilists, but then I think, like, let's say Latin American structuralism was deeply influenced by Paul Baran and by Sweezy and all of these, self-defined Marxist scholars. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about how, I understand very well how you distinguish between this neomercantilist and, this Smithian tradition, but I would want to poke your brain in regards to how do you really distinguish these other two set of thinkers, these, called Marxists. I don't know, what group of scholars you're comparing them to, and yeah, hear your opinions about where would you place modern, developmentalist economies.
Thanks. And I think this is a very important question, because lots of scholars of developmentalists have been sort of mixing and remixing and reinventing this variety: Marxist, class categories, group categories, monopoly, trade imbalances. So there is lots there that it's very difficult to. So you have a big problem here now. Right?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it goes to another book which I'm just completing right now, which is an attempt to, and this is the book that I began writing before I got sidetracked by realizing this history was not well told. But this other book is essentially trying to describe the debates about global political economy between basically Smith up to 1945. And so, I have chapters on the Marxist tradition in that book. And as I highlight there, there's overlaps. But there's overlaps between all these ideologies. So, for example, John Stuart Mill, central figure for 19th century classical liberalism, endorsed infant industry protectionism, and similarly, there are many Marxists who are big free traders, and there's a big part of the tradition in the 19th century. And so it's not to suggest that these camps are, in some way isolated spheres. There's just all kinds of overlap. I will say, having said that, I will say that I think there's some importance in identifying what the core priority is that is different. And so to me, and this is the way I define it in the book, the core priority of a Marxist tradition is to be challenging capitalism in order to address class exploitation. I think that's kind of, if you had to summarize it in a sentence, which isn't to say they don't want to use neomercantilist policies maybe as part of that project, but that's the core priority. And similarly for a neomercantilist, a number of them are interested in class issues, there's no question, but their priority, what's the core priority? State power and wealth, that's the goal. And so that's all I'm trying to suggest, without trying to suggest there's not all those kinds of overlap. And if I can just emphasize there that that the difference in those core priorities does lead to great tension between Marxists and neomercantilists historically. So this goes back to Marx and List themselves. As many of you will know, Marx and List were in a similar environment, and Marx's introduction to political economy itself, his interest in political economy, was generated, at least in part, by his reading of List's 1841 book, to which he reacts very negatively. And he says, where's the class in this book? And he's certainly right about, List's book has no interest in distributional issues of any kind. And Marx kind of, critiques them very strongly to say, List is essentially a tool of the German bourgeoisie. This is not a progressive project. And I think that division between, neomercantilists and Marxists, you can see it reappear at so many other moments. So in the Latin American context, like I would put, Prebisch much more in a kind of neomercantilist camp. He's a fairly conservative figure, right? He's a central banker, Argentina in 1930s. He's no great fan of Marxism. He's interested in state-led industrialization in a kind of a Listian way, drawing on Bunge was his teacher, after all. And Bunge is a very conservative figure, right? No fan of Marxism at all. And at the same time, you have the dependency school, which draws on structuralist thought. No question, they're influenced by Ekla and Sepal, whatever. But they're also very frustrated by what Sepal is calling for, because where's the revolution involved in that, and where's the social side of the structuralist project? So there's overlap, no question, dependency theory is influenced by structuralist thought, but I do think they have these roots. I've written an article with Antulio Rosales about this, that I think the roots of that structuralist dependency debate in Latin America can be actually found earlier in the Mariátegui debate with Aya de la Torre, in the Peruvian context, where Aya de la Torre essentially has a kind of, I think, a quasi neomercantilist view. He's interested in, except in his case, it's so creative, where he has what he calls a Indo-American economic nationalism. The whole region, this is his APRA project, is going to unify Latin America, but not really, he calls himself a socialist, but he's not interested in, Mariátegui's. They have a split in the late 1920s on this issue of how important is class and the revolution. And so I think that tension, so long answer, lots of overlap. I don't mean to say this is an overlap, but also I think some different core, what's the core priority? Does that help at all?
Thanks, Eric. I think you really fleshed out a number of, which by the way are in today development discourse, are also part of the resurging as part of critique of some experience of developmental state. And it's interesting how you characterize some of this, figure, because you talk about relatively conservative figures, but we can also talk about how that more progressive reformist agenda was coming actually from an intellectual bourgeoisie of a different type, right? Which was actually promoting a different type of reform agenda, which not necessarily was always delivering on the ground. Kino, and then we go back to Eric. Kino.
Thanks, Antonio, and thanks, Eric, for a great presentation and also really, really great book. As you said at the beginning of the presentation, of course, for List, industrialization was sort of one of the most important insights, or the importance of industrialization. Equally, List is being used to argue for the importance of manufacturing. And I was wondering if all, particularly sort of also non-Eurocentric or European neomercantilists have this importance of manufacturing as like sort of the key insight, or if there are also others that have looked at other sort of non-industry, non-manufacturing aspects, and how that would sort of influence a sort of modern version of neomercantilism that might also talk about trade and services.
Thanks, Kino. And by the way, it would be nice if you could link this to also the point we raised about this fallacy of composition, right? Because we are talking about developing an export-led model and how this export-led model fits with that picture of also development.
Yeah, great point. Very interesting point. As is the fallacy of composition issue, treat them very separately. So it's a very interesting question about the centrality of industrialization. I think what struck me in reading the debates outside of North America and outside of Europe was the commercial side. I call it commercial neomercantilism, was often very prominent. And so a sense in which is not just that our industry's been destroyed by the British, but also that their shipping and their banks and all of this kind of broader commercial activity is undermining the power and wealth of whatever state was being concerned. So the Koreans are very concerned about that. The Japanese are very concerned about that. Many Latin American thinkers were concerned about that. And interesting, like in Africa, I give the example of the Ashanti in West Africa. You know, it's a kind of a commercial form of neomercantilism there, where they're trying. It's not really about cultivating industry initially. It's much more about the control of the trade, is the key. So you're right to say that, and this is, you know, yet one more problem with focusing on List, because List is so heavily industry focused. I will say though that List was very interested in shipping, right? And so he calls, when he talks about industry, he actually includes shipping within it. And so he does have a slight, you know, he's slightly into the commercial realm, but that's about it. So yeah, so, and then you were jumping to the current period, which I think is a really interesting point to make, that in the current period, you know, a neo-mercantilist project in the current era is a lot about other stuff, you know, even AI and the digital economy, etc. So if you look at like the Chinese Made in China 2025 program, which is, I think, a nice example of a neo-mercantilist project, you know, look at the sectors they're targeting. Some of them are, you know, like robotic manufacturing, but there's all kinds of things which are not, we wouldn't describe as Listian in a manufacturing sense. And that's true of the American side too. Like the American push for industrial policy right now is a lot about, you know, non-industrial things, although we call it industrial policy still. And by the way, that relates, if I can just take a slight sidetrack into the question about green, you know, the relationship between green goals and neomercantilism, which I didn't have a time to address, climate change, etc. You know, there's a lot of neomercantilist thought today about, you know, trying to be at the top of clean energy, or the, you know, the new clean industries or whatever. And a lot of that is neo-mercantilist, like we want to be the best, we want to be the leading sector in that. And in some ways, you know, the mobilization of resources to get to a clean economy is going to involve some appeals to neo-mercantilist ideology, I think, because that's how you get the state to mobilize, you know. Who's going to be first in this sector? And there's a lot of writing about that, the kind of green industrial policies, whatever. To go to the question about fallacy of composition, so this is a very interesting question, because I think the label, like I go through at the beginning of the book, those of you who had a chance to read it, about some of the downsides of using the label neo-mercantilism. And one of the downsides, because there's it's got a lot of baggage, and one of the parts of baggage around that label is a sense of, oh, you're only after your own interests, you know, and so it's a kind of a derogatory term, you know, you're a mercantilist, you're only concerned with your own state. And that's certainly the priority of these thinkers. I don't mean to downplay that, but many of them also put it in a broader global context. And that was really fascinating to me. I have to admit, I wasn't expecting that. And so that begins with List himself, who has ultimately a liberal cosmopolitan end goal. Like he's basically saying, look, Germany, France, or German states, France, and the United States are behind. I want them to do neo-mercantilist policies to catch up. But once they catch up and everyone's equal, let's have free trade. And in fact, let's have a global federation. Like that's his vision. And so it's bizarre, you know, that the most famous neo-mercantilists today actually had a long-term liberal cosmopolitan end goal. Like it's just odd. And you can see that with some other figures. So Carey is the same way. Carey puts his ideas in a very cosmopolitan thing. He says, I'm after the American state power and wealth, but it's part of a broader project of destroying the trading class of the world. And once they can be destroyed and British power can be diminished, we can have a world, in his case, of sovereignty respecting countries. He doesn't want the federation that List wants. He wants a kind of a world of free trade with, you know, everyone respecting each other's sovereignty in conditions of equality between states. And then the East Asians, I think, are the most interesting, because a lot of them are basically needing, like they're engaging with Confucian thinkers in their own country who are saying to them, what you're calling for, you know, the aggressive promotion of power and wealth is immoral in the context of the Confucian classics. And so they're forced to defend their position by saying, well, it's the first stage towards a longer vision. And so they say, you know, China needs to acquire state power and wealth very rapidly in a very, you know, neo-mercantilist way, but with the goal of bringing about a more equal world globally. Like they have and they cast that in different ways, but this is similar kind of sense of a cosmopolitan, in this case, kind of Confucian cosmopolitan vision that I explained in the book. I don't have time to explain here. Anyway, and if I can give one other example, I think this is where the Sarkar or Manulescu are very interesting, because they also are saying we want protectionism, but let's cast this in the context of the League of Nations. And what are the goals of the League of Nations? The League of Nations wants peace. The League of Nations wants equality of states and all these things. And they say neomercantilism is the route to do that. Free trade does the opposite. And so they're casting it as something more than just the interests of their own state. And I've written a lot about the history of the Bretton Woods Conference, where I think it's interesting the extent to which that got incorporated into the Bretton Woods framework. And people don't think of, the IMF and the World Bank as proponents of neomercantilism in the current age. But if you look at the negotiations that generated them in the early 1940s, the American policymakers were very keen to emphasize to Latin American countries, who, after all, were almost a majority of the delegates at Bretton Woods. It's important to remember. There's 44 delegations, 19 of them are from Latin America. Okay, so and it's a one country, one vote system of the conference. They needed Latin America to endorse Bretton Woods. And what they were saying to Latin American leaders was, we will let you do state-led industrialization within the Bretton Woods system. That was the pitch that they made. And you can find that embedded in the design of the IMF Articles of Agreement, which say things that allow you to do that. And in fact, the Americans were sending money doctors to places like Paraguay and a number of Central American countries in the mid-1940s promoting this vision. It all stops with the Cold War, but that was the original kind of conception. And that was kind of interesting, because it was kind of like Sarkar, and these other thinkers' vision. Like, you can have a multilateral order, which is endorsing neomercantilist policies of poorer countries in a way that might be compatible with liberal multilateral order. And I think it's weird. Like, I've just really been struck by this, the extent to which some of the pioneering ideas of multilateral institutions were not liberals. They were neomercantilists. So I give the example of List. He has the idea of a World Trade Congress in 1837. Like, that's pretty early on, right? Sun Yat-sen invents what I think might be, if not the first, one of the first proposals for a World Bank. Like, these aren't liberal figures, they're neomercantilists. And so they're immediately thinking, I have a project for my own state, but I want to put this in some multilateral framework. And so that, I don't know if that answers the fallacy of composition question, but I'm just suggesting they did have a global vision. As part of what they're, advancing. By the way, not all of them, but some of them.
Thanks, Eric. No, I think we are, we could keep going on forever. And I think this discussion also about how much manufacturing play a role, right? Because I could, just to end on a more advocate's devil type of point of view, it seems that List, as much as Hamilton, had a theory of value and power, that it's grounded in specific characteristics of manufacturing, that actually the commercial, the trading, when you talked about a mercantilist idea based on commercial power, that is a completely different, it would be against even the pre-Listian idea, right? If you go back to Antonio Serra or the scholars that were having a theory of value creation that was linked to international trade and the capacity division later then is picked up by Smith, of course. So in a sense, I think we open up even more layers of variety in terms of what is the underpinning theory, not just of the state power, but also what are the sources of power for the state, right? Which of course, it's so central to developmentalism and the industrialization project in the post-colonial world. I have to stop because I know everyone would like to probably say another word. Thanks so much for this, giving us the chance of this fascinating conversation. And we again strongly endorse the book, which I think it's an important contribution, in particular also in this new movement that is trying to decolonize curricula and trying to open up our understanding of the shaping and development of global ideas, and certainly neomercantilism has an important central role to play into that. So thanks so much, Eric, again. Thanks, Olga, for fantastic comments, everyone who joined, and hopefully we will continue this conversation.
Can I just thank you as well, and especially Olga, for such fantastic questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. See you
Thank
soon.
you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.